Greetings, everybody. Let me introduce myself. I'm Geetanjali Chopra. I'm the Communications and External Affairs Manager for the East Asia and Pacific region of the World Bank. I'm happy to welcome you all to the launch of the East Asia and Pacific Economic Update for April 2026. It's titled Industrial Policy in the Digital Age. I'm very pleased to introduce the distinguished guests and panel of experts today. From the World Bank, we have Carlos Felipe Jaramillo, Vice President for the East Asia Pacific region, and Aditya Mattu, who's our Director of Research at the World Bank Group. Welcome. Our panel of esteemed experts include Kun Chantavaran Sucharita Kun, who's the advisory panel member, ASEAN Plus 3, Macroeconomic Research Office, AMRO, and former Assistant Governor, Bank of Thailand. And also Dato Lulian, who is the CEO of Invest Penang, Malaysia. Please forgive me if I don't get the pronunciation right. For the program today, we will start with opening remarks by Felipe, who's our Vice President for the East Asia and Pacific region, and then Aditya, who's our Director of Research, will present the key findings of the report. After the presentation, we'll move to the panel discussion. And during the discussion, our panel of experts will then share with us their insights into jobs in East Asia and the Pacific. For now, let me invite Felipe, World Bank Vice President for the East Asia Pacific region, to deliver his opening remarks. Over to you, Felipe.
Can you unmute, sir?
You're on mute.
Thank you very much, Geetanjali. And good morning, good evening to everyone joining us virtually. And thank you for taking the time to be with us today. It is a pleasure to introduce the latest East Asia and Pacific Economic Update from the World Bank, and to briefly highlight three key messages from the report before my colleague Aditya walks you through the analysis in more detail. Number one, rising oil and energy shocks are expected to weigh on growth across the region, with impacts differing across countries depending on their reliance on energy imports and the available policy space to respond. While many economies in East Asia Pacific enter this period with relatively strong macro fundamentals, others face high inflation, limited fiscal space, or high debt vulnerability. As a result, our report projects regional growth to slow to 4.2% in 2026, down from 5.0% last year in 2025. And we foresee that if this shock is prolonged in time, it could further dampen growth and disproportionately affect the poor households through higher living costs and perhaps raised unemployment. The second message is that there is also a positive story around AI-driven opportunities in our region. The global AI boom is reshaping technology supply chains and spurring investment. Some economies in our region, led by Vietnam and Malaysia, are emerging as important exporters of AI-related products. And with further investments in connectivity, in digital infrastructure, and skills, we believe that broader AI adoption across the region could accelerate productivity growth and support long-term development. And number three, and final message, our report highlights how industrial policy, well designed, can help boost growth and create more productive jobs. Jobs is the focus of the World Bank Group over the last year and a half. The key priorities are to strengthen foundational public goods, to remove policy distortions that constrain competition, and to deploy targeted interventions carefully and sequentially. Getting this sequencing right is essential to ensure that policies raise productivity and support sustainable job creation. That is a quick summary of the three broad messages. And with that, I would like to turn to Aditya Mathu, who up until a few days ago was our chief economist for East Asia Pacific. And he has recently moved to become the director of the Development Research Group of the World Bank. And today we have the pleasure of having him present the report's findings and policy implications in greater detail. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Felipe, for that helpful introduction. I hope you can see my screen. As usual, I'll begin by describing some of the recent developments and the outlook for the region, and then turn to the special focus on industrial policy in the digital age. As Felipe said, we are seeing slowing growth in 2026 across the region. In China, largely because of a domestic recalibration in order to strike a better balance between the longer-term quality of growth and short-term growth, but also in much of the rest of the region. We see, one positive development, though, even as growth slows down, is we expect a rebound in 2027 if the global geopolitical tensions ease and if the global policy uncertainty diminishes. We see three real important determinants of near-term growth. First, of course, the conflict in the Middle East, which Felipe mentioned, but also the persistence of trade restrictions, and perhaps even more so, a climate of policy uncertainty. And finally, a slight silver lining, which is the AI boom. We also argue that the region does not need to see itself as a passive victim of external developments, but can forge its own destiny through the choice of sound macroeconomic policies, which include support for people and firms, as well as the deeper structural reforms that are needed to support a strong recovery and longer-term growth. Let me describe briefly what are the elements of these three external shocks that matter. First, we have seen a spike in geopolitical risk indices, as well as in oil and natural gas prices. Worryingly, even after the recent ceasefire, we see that oil prices in the future are likely to be as much as $20 higher than they were before the conflict began. The channels through which the conflict will hurt the countries include, first of all, higher costs of production, both in agriculture and in industry. Supply chain disruptions, whether it is through maritime choke points or the disruption in the production of chips, which would then permeate the whole supply chain, and tighter financing conditions. For example, even in Indonesia and Philippines today, spreads have increased by 30 basis points. We worry about slower global growth, which matters profoundly for a region that's exposed to the world through its exports, because of the greater uncertainty and the weaker business climate. And finally, there are the specific channel of lower remittances, which matter very much for countries like the Philippines, where as much as 1.5% of GDP is attributable to remittances from the Gulf alone. And also worrying is the impact on inequality, because the poor spend more on fuel as a share of their incomes. We see the impact on individual countries depending, as Felipe said, on how exposed they are in terms of how much of their economy depends on imported oil, especially that which passes through the Strait of Hormuz. How vulnerable they are in terms of existing inflation and existing current account deficits. And finally, how equipped they are to respond in terms of the monetary and fiscal space they have today. The report presents a detailed assessment, but here I summarize it in just looking at oil and gas imports as a share of total GDP. And you see Laos, PDR, Mongolia, Thailand, Cambodia, they stand out, as well as some of the countries in the Pacific in terms of their dependence on imported oil. Again, in terms of vulnerability, you have a country like Laos, PDR, and also Mongolia, which have relatively high external financing needs. And in terms of the capacity to respond, again, Laos, PDR stands out in terms of existing large levels of government debt, and the Pacific because of its low debt carrying capacity and high dependence on external assistance. When you look at the empirical impact of these factors, we estimate that if oil prices were to be $20 higher for a sustained period, you would see inflation increase on average by 0.5% across the region, but more so in countries like Philippines and Thailand. And again, if the oil prices were to remain about $20 higher, we would see a hit to industrial production by as much as 1/5 of a percentage point. Of course, if the oil price increases greater, these effects would be significantly magnified. But it's not just the direct effect on the region. This region exports a lot to the world and draws a lot of income in some countries from remittances. Therefore, a slowing growth in the world will hit the region. A 1% slower growth in the G7 countries would reduce growth in the region by 0.6, and a 1% slower growth in China by 0.3%. So both direct and indirect effects of this conflict will impose a significant development tax on the region. Countries are responding. They're responding through explicit energy subsidies, through cash transfers and tax reductions, and support to certain sectors of the economy like agriculture, which might suffer the consequences of high fertilizer prices. But each of these three types of interventions highlight a central trade-off. The more support that the government gives today, the less discriminate it is, the higher the fiscal cost, the higher the debt, the higher the interest rates in the future, and therefore the slower the growth. Therefore, the more targeted the interventions, the less acute the impact on future growth. A lot can be learned from the COVID experience, where countries with better registries were able to reach the poor, but also the vulnerable in the middle class, the small firms, but also the middle enterprises which were vulnerable. Some countries are also taking measures like changing working, allowing work from home. But there again, there is a trade-off. The less people travel, the less they spend on food in cafeterias, the more it hurts incomes and growth. Others have resorted to export restrictions on scarce products like fertilizers, but that again involves a trade-off. The more you protect your producers and consumers at home, the more you inflict pain on other countries which rely on those exports. But that is not the only problem. The problem is that this conflict has come on top of other shocks. Not counting COVID, there has also been a disruption in the global trading environment. Tariffs in an important market like the United States increased significantly in 2025. A recent Supreme Court ruling reduced those tariffs, but soon they were augmented through new temporary tariffs. The region today faces tariff rates which are as much on average as 14% higher than they were in 2024, with a larger burden on a small country like Cambodia and a smaller burden with a country like Malaysia. Those higher tariffs are hurting incomes. A country like Vietnam, which is relatively more exposed because of its high dependence on exports, could see its income lower by 1 percentage point because of this increase in protection. But it's not just the level of protection that matters. Just as these temporary tariffs and temporary ceasefires, there is a problem of global uncertainty. And that uncertainty includes trade policy uncertainty. Very careful work by my colleagues has shown that this uncertainty itself has a powerful inhibiting effect on investment. If uncertainty increases by 1 standard deviation, investment by listed firms declines by as much as 5%. At the same time, it hits employment. Employment rates could be as much as 0.5 percentage point lower, or unemployment 0.5 percentage higher because of this uncertainty. And that's not all. Because firms in an uncertain environment are reluctant to hire people on durable contracts, uncertainty also increases the likelihood of temporary job contracts by as much as 4 or 5%. So thus, both the jobs and the quality of jobs are victims of increased policy uncertainty. Turning now to the silver lining. The AI boom has led to a big increase in exports of AI-related goods. For example, countries like Malaysia and Vietnam, where AI-related goods were about a fifth or a fourth of GDP, now export 1/3 of their GDP in terms of AI goods. At the same time, you've seen a big increase in investment in data center capacity, especially in Malaysia. Existing capacity is as much as 700 megawatts, but another 2,000 or more megawatts of investment are planned. Thus, the AI value chain already sees the region participating through both trade and investment. The problem is the productivity gains that AI offers depend on how fast the technology is used and diffuses. And there our region lags behind. While the numbers for China are imperfect, you can see quite clearly that for much of our region, AI diffusion, as Felipe said, is limited by weaknesses in human capital, the skills that people need to work with AI, and also the weaknesses in some countries in infrastructure like high-speed broadband. Therefore, your ability to take advantage of the one positive shock is limited, while your exposure to the negative shocks is much higher than the rest of the world. It's dealing with this problem that is particularly acute because one aspect of this lagging innovation is that much of the growth in this region has not come from higher total factor productivity, which reflects innovation, which reflects increased efficiency, but has come from more capital accumulation. Now that is worrying because in an uncertain environment, investment is declining. Therefore, there is a particular need to improve the performance of firms. And there we see another problem, that the leading firms in the region are falling behind the global frontier precisely in the digital intensive sectors which offer the greatest scope for innovation. So the regional leaders risk becoming global laggards because they are falling behind also in the adoption of the most recent technologies. The frontier firms, the best firms, are further behind the frontier firms in the world, then the weak firms in the region are behind the weak firms in the world. So it is this climate of slowing growth, declining productivity, and firms falling further behind that is leading countries to turn to an old favorite, industrial policy, to try and revive growth and productivity. We have seen across the world a spate of industrial policy measures which really began in 2019, and that also affected the region's policy choices. You've seen the more advanced countries like Japan and Korea rely more on export incentives. There are countries like China and also the Philippines, which seem to rely a lot on subsidies. And then countries like Vietnam and Thailand also resort a lot to trade policy measures. The big and important question for us today is, how far can we expect this industrial policy to be a silver bullet? Given the mixed experience in the past, what have we learned from the use of industrial policy? And here we have in our report a lot of details, but I'm going to just pick out a few examples. One is what countries are choosing to do. Indonesia, through its export restrictions, is hoping that it is going to export not just minerals, but more finished products like metals and perhaps eventually electronic vehicles. Vietnam is strengthening its workforce to move up the semiconductor value chain and perform more sophisticated tasks. Thailand is seeking to make a transition from its successful participation in the internal combustion engine value chains towards the EV value chain. And Malaysia has a new industrial master plan, again seeking to enhance its participation in the semiconductor and other value chains. Now, what do we learn from the past? Korea has relied heavily on industrial policies for heavy manufacturing, and it did succeed in increasing output. It also succeeded in increasing productivity and employment. And perhaps most strikingly, if you look at the cost of the support that was provided and compare it with the benefits, you see that it was generally positive. The benefits were higher than the cost. And the final interesting twist is that more support was granted precisely to those sectors like metals and machinery and chemicals, which had the higher returns in terms of welfare. So, at least in heavy manufacturing, Korea's industrial policy, which was largely transparent, conditioned on performance, and limited in time, was both effective and efficient. Turning now to another powerful example of shipbuilding in China. Support for the shipbuilding industry led to a spectacular increase in China's share of global shipbuilding from less than 10% to nearly half the world market. But when you look more closely at the benefits and costs, you find a different picture from Korea. In most cases, the benefits were less than the costs, so that the ratio is less than 1 in each case. And that suggests that while the policies were effective, they were not necessarily efficient. And there's a salutary lesson for countries which have less money to spend, that it is not just in producing striking outcomes. For example, Indonesia's increase of metals and other downstream exports have increased, but it is also necessary for Indonesia to evaluate whether this intervention has been efficient in the sense whether the cost of support is less than the benefits that are being obtained. One other interesting example is of how in this new AI world, access to public procurement contracts gave Chinese firms access to government data and led them and equip them to develop new commercial software. And interestingly, many other developing countries today largely use open source Chinese AI models rather than the proprietary AI models developed in other richer countries. So this again shows an interesting trade-off. Sometimes domestic industrial policy can produce positive spillover benefits, as has happened in the case of Chinese solar panels, electronic vehicles, and now perhaps in AI. But sometimes they also have a beggar thy neighbor aspect, where industrial policy in one country inhibits the development of the same industries in other countries. Having taken stock of this, what we argue is that today it remains imperative for countries in the region to invest in human capital, in infrastructure, and stronger institutions. Those are what we believe foundational public goods. It is also important for countries to get rid of the bad policies in place, the restrictions, the non-tariff barriers in both goods and especially in services. For example, in a country like Vietnam, removing barriers to services partially when they acceded to the WTO produced not just increased productivity in services, but also in manufacturing. Thus, services reform might well be the most powerful industrial policy in the region. But the point we make is that where we then think of targeted interventions in terms of specific support for specific sectors and dealing with market failures, it is most effective when it follows the investments in public goods and the removal of bad policies or policy failures. And there I show you quickly, to end and conclude, a picture of the situation across the region, beginning with a country like Vietnam, which has also been very successful in manufacturing, but still involves largely foreign capital and foreign technologies working with domestic labor. They have done remarkably well in improving education. They have opened up a lot in goods and significantly in services, and they have also provided tax exemptions for foreign investment. That contrasts with the experience of countries like Malaysia and Thailand, which have also seen domestic capital break-in, though they still rely heavily on foreign technology because they succeeded in developing stronger tertiary education, were reasonably open, and have provided incentives both to foreign and domestic firms. But most powerful is the example of China and Korea, which, unlike Malaysia and Thailand, are also now relying on domestic technology as well as domestic capital and domestic labor. They have accomplished this through strong STEM education, excellent infrastructure, uneven openness in services, but large openness in goods. I say uneven because China remains in some areas relatively closed, but incentives not just for investment, but also for research and development, and encouraging coordination between national firms like Samsung and Hynix to collaborate in research and development. So that is a broad spectrum of development in the region, and we are fortunate now, as I end my presentation, to have excellent panelists from the region who can tell us more about the experience of countries in the region. And you have already been introduced, but if I can spell out in a little bit more detail. First of all, we have Dato Lu, Dato Lu Lian, who's the Chief Executive Officer since 2010 of Invest Penang. She's the principal, Invest Penang is the principal investment promotion agency of the Penang state government. And Dato Lu has also led state strategies on foreign direct investment, on global shared services, on small and medium enterprises, and talent initiatives. So we're very happy to have you here with us, as well as Kun Chantavaran Sucharitakal, who's on the advisory panel of this ASEAN +3 Macroeconomic Research Office, AMRO. She's the former assistant governor of the Bank of Thailand from 2022 to 2024. She was the special advisor to the Eastern Economic Corridor Office of Thailand, which is like a grand special economic zone. And in 2025, she was appointed as advisor to the Senate Subcommittee on Capital Markets and Insurance Business. Welcome, Kun Shantavaran, also. So let me begin by asking you the first question. So we will follow broadly the structure of the report in focusing first on recent events and then turning to these efforts to promote industry. So Thailand stands out in terms of its relatively high dependence on imported oil. So the question for you is, how do you see Thailand responding to this energy shock? And what can be or should be done to mitigate the adverse effects? And if you want to broaden your answer to the region as a whole, I would welcome your advice for all of us.
Well, thank you very much, Atitya, and thank you for this timely report. I think it's hitting us all at the same time within less than 2 months. Let me begin by saying that like all countries that are dependent on oil, we're doing everything and using measures on all sides, from energy saving to protecting the vulnerable, and also hoping to transition. The transitioning part is a bit slow. It needs all the help, but I think the numbers are working better now. Previously, to install solar panel, we have cost individuals, households, and firms. The numbers may not be working then, but with this elevated oil price, I think the acceleration towards alternative energy is really happening on all fronts, especially when I looked at your comments on the EV cars. Also, it's also coming at a very timely juncture where it's really helping to ease the burden of households that may have to pay a higher cost of petrol. Anyway, yeah, like I said, we're doing on all fronts, the energy saving, protecting the vulnerable, looking for alternative sources of supply, then the Middle East, and then alternative energy. And I think you said it right that the region has entered this 2026 in a much stronger position, despite the tariff and the trade war of last year, in part because we have all been the beneficiary of this tech upcycle, the AI boom, you're right. We benefit, big or small, depending on our level and our place in that supply chain. Maybe that was a saving grace for most of us in this turbulent time. So let me stop here. Thank you.
Just one follow-up question. In terms of the fiscal position, there is reasonable private debt already in Thailand, also government debt. There was a digital wallet scheme which involved support across the country. So when we think of buffers, one of the things we wonder, it is a challenge politically. You need to provide support, but ideally the support is given to the small and medium enterprises or the poor and the vulnerable households. How do you see that evolving? Because Thailand is relatively sophisticated in terms of having the digital infrastructure to target support to those who need it when they need it. How do you feel that strategy of whether to go broad-based or targeted, is there a sensitivity? How do you feel that's playing out?
I think there is a realization that resources are limited, that we need to be more targeted in our assistance to our citizens. And maybe there is also the need for the other sectors, like the big corporates also to help out, including the banking system. So it's an effort from all sides, both the government, the private sector, the stronger corporates, as well as the banking system that are well capitalized to also help ease the burden of their SME clients. Thank you.
Thank you, Kun Shantavaran. Firms in Penang, How are they being affected by this oil price shock? Through what channels?
Good morning, and thank you for inviting me to this panel. I think overall in Malaysia, we are also going through the same this oil shock. All the prices have gone up, and I think the Malaysian government is also taking several steps to try to reduce that shock. Like, you know, we do have a fuel subsidy, so that's been reduced. You know, we've been asked, if possible, to work from home, reduce the air conditioning and all that. But I think in a way, Malaysia luckily is also an oil exporter, but net wise we're still importing oil. On the industrial on the ground, companies have reported a increase in, of course, the oil prices, raw material, especially those that are the petroleum based. It's increased about 10 to 20%. Logistics costs have increased. Insurance costs for logistics have increased. The time for shipment has also been increased to about 14 days because of the close down of the Straits of Hormuz. Inventory, I think for now, the industries are still reporting that, you know, they have sufficient inventory, but they foresee that if this conflict continues, that inventory disruption or the inventory drawdown will be felt from June onwards. Some customers there hasn't been any reduction in demand, so it is more so cost pressures, profit compression that they forecast would happen in the next quarter or so. They're also seeing that for some customers, they are pulling in the shipment just so that make sure that they don't, you know, have more disruption in supplies. So that's the situation on the ground. And I think for us, companies are doing whatever they can to try to navigate this supply shock. But everybody is on the look and see basis. They're not sure what's going to happen, and everybody is keeping their fingers crossed that it does not prolong more than you know, where it is happening right now. So overall price increase, especially for petroleum products, logistics cost has increased. That's the situation on the ground now.
You know, I think that is very helpful, but this shock has come after a period of, you know, trade policy turbulence. Now, first tariffs increased, they declined, then Malaysia negotiated an agreement and also semiconductors aren't yet subject to tariffs, at least to any significant extent in the US market. But it has been a period of uncertainty. How has that uncertainty affected firms' choices in terms of investment or employment? Do you see an effect?
I think for Malaysia and Penang in particular, where the bulk of our GDP contribution is in manufacturing, in industry, and particularly in the E&E industry and semiconductor. As what you have mentioned, the AI boom, the tariff uncertainty have both actually given us a huge boost in investment and in the boost in industrial activity and employment over the since 2018. I think if we were to categorize them into the period of Trump 1.0 and its China +1 tariff uncertainty, and then the COVID increase in the usage of the semiconductor products and chips, and then now with the super memory cycle and the AI boom, we've actually seen tremendous uptake in FDI, tremendous uptake. And FDI over the last period have gone up almost about 50% since COVID time. Our export figures have gone up also 50% and more over the last few years. So yes, there's tariff has created uncertainty, but I think there's always winners and losers, and we have been in a way benefiting from this. Why? It's because Penang already has a very strong base in semiconductor, and during that China Plus One movement, many of the companies here were able to expand capacity very quickly, or they find that for them to move from China to Malaysia to Penang, and that's the era where there's a lot of investment, and this capacity reconfiguration. They find that they could actually come to Penang. The infrastructure is already here, the ecosystem is here, the talent is already trained. They could just come in here and start production or set up a factory and start manufacturing from here at a very, very efficient and a very price very quickly to do that. So that we've benefited. And yeah, I'll stop if there's any questions from here.
So again, it's very interesting what you said, that the China Plus One and the AI boom have largely offset the effects of higher tariffs, which are relatively not so high. It's only about 6% on average in Malaysia, and the uncertainty. So let me ask Kun Shatavaran, China Plus One and AI boom. Now you have hard drives in Thailand and other regions that you are also likely to benefit, versus policy uncertainty and higher tariffs. Does the balance, are you one of the winners from all this?
Oh, I wouldn't claim a winner, but I think I would agree with what Dr. Lu was saying, that the AI boom surprised us as well. You remember the hard disk drive, the discussion was about sunsetting that to solid state and many others. And yet we're still seeing that because of the need for higher capacity storage. So what we thought was going to happen didn't happen. Of course, we're not going to ride on that, but and trying our best to move up. But the speed of moving up that value chain is not going to be fast enough because of the starting point that is different from other countries that have used active industrial policy to promote this sector. But we are nevertheless a beneficiary of this AI and tech upcycle, either in the hard disk drive, like you mentioned, and also in the advanced packaging and testing. So the supply chain is long enough for us, each of us, to capitalize on it, depending on what our domestic capacity is able to do. And because of the deeper economic integration within our own region, we are trading with each other much more than before. We are finding final demand within our region as well. So maybe that is also helping to shore up the risk from the external sector.
Actually, again, a very nice point that you have a finer division of labor within the region and also increasing final demand within the region. So I think the payoff from deepening regional integration is also showing itself in greater resilience to external shocks. So that is a very nice point. So let me now transition to industrial policy. You know, both of you are involved in it to at least some extent. So again, Kun Shantavan, beginning, actually for both of you, this question, but you answer first. I don't know how clear it was from my presentation, and I don't know how much time you've spent reading our scintillating report, or at least the overview of the report. But the story we say is that, look, you have to get the fundamentals right in terms of infrastructure and human capital, and there are still big weaknesses, especially on human capital. Even in a country like Malaysia, 4 out of 10 children can't add or do math as much as they should. So get the fundamentals right, get the bad policies out, especially restrictions on non-tariff barriers in goods and services, and then start doing good. First stop doing harm, then start doing good, and it might help. If you do good in a sensible, measured way, you force firms to compete rather than live in protected back gardens. And also you force the support to be finite, conditional on performance. It doesn't become a state of perpetual support for perpetual influence. So does this story, the three pillars and the importance of the first two, the fundamentals and getting rid of the bad policies before you start doing good, does it resonate with you, or does it seem too much like World Bank ideology? Kun Chandawaran, you go first.
Well, the sequence you laid out is beautiful. In real life, of course, things are moving all at the same time. You're right that we need to get rid of protectionist policies of the past, and we are using every avenues and means that we can, including accession to the OECD as an external impetus for us to change. The development of the human side is also progressing. I see a lot of firms turning to apprenticeship, taking students, vocational students in and accrediting them while working in firms. So it's probably one way to expedite that build up of the human talent in this age where everything is moving very quickly and the challenges are coming from all fronts. And of course, I hear you very strongly that the policies have to sunset. And I'm glad that our EV policy that started from the buyer side, some excise tax waivers for consumers are being wound down and moving more to the supply side, where firms are expected to produce onshore some of the battery components. So the sunset part, it resonates very well. Like all policy that we should be targeted, we should be time bound and also transparent so that the other sectors know what they have to do in terms of adjustments. Thank you.
I think that's very interesting, but let me ask you a difficult question. You know, Thailand, like the rest of the region, learned a lot from the Asian financial crisis in terms of getting its macroeconomic policies right. So you've had a period of stability. You weathered shocks like the Great Recession, COVID, everything. But you haven't had any meaningful reforms in the last 25 years. There's a period of policy inertia. And there has been, again, a persistence of quite stringent restrictions in areas like services, which we say matter. What do you see as the priorities? What would make reform happen in Thailand? You know, you see a country like Vietnam reinventing its whole government, its whole provincial structure to lend greater dynamism to its economy. And you contrast that with, you know, nothing significant or dramatic happening. Even in the countries where it happens, like Philippines and Indonesia, they do amazing legislation reforms during the day, and some of it is unraveled during the night in the implementing legislation. So, but Thailand, you don't see either of those happening. Why? And what can be done?
Well, I hope you give us the benefit of the doubt, because as we speak now, the government is presenting its policy platform to Parliament. It's a two-day event, today and tomorrow, and you will see that there is a lot of element of reform in that party announcement to Parliament. I think the reality that reform has been slow in this country is being perceived and well understood by every party. If you watch our election previously, every party does raise this issue of the need for reform. So I think it's high on the agenda. From now on, it's the execution part, which I think every sector is watching: the media, the private sector, every stakeholder is helping to move forward this reform agenda.
Thank you, Kun Chantavaran, for this optimistic response. Datu Lu, you know, Penang is at the heart of the semiconductor sector in Malaysia. But you also face a different kind of progression problem, that there has been assembly, packaging, testing is really at the heart of what is happening. How much progression has there been into, you know, more sophisticated, higher value segments? And what are the challenges firms face in making this progression?
I liked your slide where you compared, your final slide where you compared, I think that was Vietnam, and then that's Malaysia, and then that's Korea and Japan. I think that probably speaks a lot of what is really happening on the ground and what's happened in the last probably decade or so on the industrial movement. And I'd probably like to also comment a little bit about what you mentioned, the 3 pillars that you talked about. And I think it's all that sequencing that what we mentioned. It's how do you sequence that? I think sunsetting that policy, it's really very much a political will as well as you know, and for example, my position is really very much on implementation on the ground and trying to do what we can of what policy has been set and trying to implement that. Now we have been for the last 50 years, we started semiconductor, probably ahead of many other countries in the world. And in Malaysia's industrialization probably also started at the same time with South Korea. And I'm actually quite amazed by the transformation of how South Korea has now been able, through very purposeful policy and also putting their resources into what is important for the country, and they have therefore been able to grow domestic giants, you know, and now moved from just back end to even front end in the head of this, especially for this AI era. In Malaysia, you're right, we are very much stuck in the OSAT back end, but I'm right now also, so why? I think because we were for many decades very much driven by trying to attract FDI and really much into giving a lot of incentives for FDI to be located here. So that's one thing. And I think the lack of properly innovation, R&D incentives for local, I think we should be more purposeful in terms of technology transfers from the multinationals to the local. Those are policies that we probably have to work on. And I think our new industrial master plan and our national semiconductor strategy, which we also launched in 2024, as well as the new incentive framework, has looked into that and tried to address that. And in Penang, you're right, we contribute 13% of the global OSAT operation, and the majority of them is in Penang. So we are also doing more of the left shift now into IC design and also moving into advanced test equipment. Those are the 2 areas that we're now focusing on. And in those 2 pillars, our focus is now developing the local domestic companies in this value chain. So it's more so giving them more incentive. The national investment framework now, it's geared towards more for bringing in more value investment rather than just dollar per se. And also the way that the incentive will be given is also depends on how you spur the local economy, what's your value add, how do you bring the local companies into the global value chain. And those are all activities that we're currently focused on. Hopefully we can grow domestic giants like our other Asian countries, but I think we're a long way off. And towards your point, one of the factors which you think that could be a limitation to this will also be financial access, probably human resource capabilities, bringing in more talented and experienced engineers from overseas. So those are perhaps limitations that we have now, which if we were to liberalize, it would be able to help us move up into the higher value activities.
You have anticipated, something that I was going to ask you is just how can we domesticate this value chain, both in terms of the example, how Korea saw significant participation of domestic capital, and how as you know, what I'm saying, I learned from you that, there was a period where at least the federal incentives were more targeted towards foreign investment and less towards domestic investment. So in a way, you were creating better conditions for foreign investors. But now the need to encourage domestic investors, also a lot of the innovation, the intellectual property, the patents are by foreigners based in Malaysia and relatively few by Malaysian firms. So I think the kind of support that we saw in Korea, both for domestic capital to form stronger links with multinationals, to emerge more as active participants and innovative participants, I think that's good. You also made the point about drawing talent into the thing, but there is also the challenge for you of retaining talent, because a lot of smart Malaysians still seek jobs in Singapore. But if I turn quickly to you, Kun Shantavan, about the challenges that Thailand faces in transitioning from participation from this internal combustion engine value chain to participation in the EV value chain. But also if you can, based on your experience as a special advisor for the Eastern Economic Corridor of Thailand, say what have we learned from this experience? What has worked? What has not worked in a way that is relevant for the region?
It's going to be a while to transition, not well. How shall I say? The adoption rate has been quick because of the the energy crisis. I think it's very clear, but the supply response will take time. In terms of producing our own EV car, I mean, it's one thing to be importing, which helps in the adoption and the energy saving, but it's also one thing to be a producer of those alternative mobility that are much more energy saving and more climate friendly. I think it's enough time to transition for every part and components of this very elaborate automotive chain to adjust themselves along the way. People tell me that even if there's no engine, there's still sofa and there's still wheels and there's still windshield wipers. The elements of the car are still, and all these takes time. It's good to be communicating to the part and components industry, which is the strength of Thailand, to also adjust themselves and perhaps look to other industries that we could channel these resources, given that they may not need all the parts and components in the same regime as the combustion.
Lessons from Eastern Economic Corridor. What worked, what doesn't work?
Well, the Eastern Economic Corridor was designed as a one-stop to be able to provide licensing permits, incentives to the foreign investors, but the choice of which sector, it's going to be a market-driven process. And we even discussed among ourselves that it's probably not the right way to call it the EV strategy, but next generation automotive, because it could be beyond EV. And I know I'm conscious that the time is 1 hour.
I should be more conscious, but I'm not worried. I'm finding this very interesting. No, I don't want to keep you very long. Let me ask a final question. Both of you are admirably suited and may soon in my lifetime be ministers of industry or ministers of industry and trade. What are the 2 or 3 things you would do first to try and get better, more development promoting participation in global value chains in your respective countries? So, Datulu, you first.
I would invest in human capital. I think producing or educating a young workforce that's interested in STEM, in innovation, in creativity, in sciences, in engineering is probably the key. And that is always the first fundamental question that any investors would always ask me. What is your engineering output in your country? And I think countries like China, they do a tremendous effort in doing that. That would be my first key focus on.
Then, so your answer is that I would choose to be the Minister of Education rather than the Minister of Industry.
That's a very, very important. That's a very, very important portfolio.
I just wanted to say, by the way, Kun Shantavar, in response to your IC question, my colleagues in Thailand have actually done very interesting work looking at the overlap between the combustion engine and the EV value chain. So if they're listening, or if they're not, I'll ask them to send it to you. We also have done interesting work, Dato' Lu, on fixing the foundations in education, and also how important it is to reorient primary health care towards non-communicable diseases, which are also going to eat away at productivity of people in the prime of their life. And that's called a healthy future. So I would love my colleagues who work in these areas to meet you and learn from you. Kun Shantavaran, I hope you will stay Minister of Industry. What would you do?
Well, you asked me that one single policy agenda, I would go for liberalization, deregulation. I think the market will find its way. I believe in the market. Having spoken to a lot of private sectors, investors that come to see us, I think that would really go a long way into channeling resources to the new areas. Thank you very much.
No, I think that's brilliant, because I think the point that we believe is, as Felipe said, jobs are the focus of our institution, but jobs don't fall from heaven. They come from creating capacity, as you were describing, Dato' Lu, human capacity, and they come from creating opportunity, as you said, Kun Shantavaran, through liberalization. And so I hope very much that Dato' Lu becomes Minister of Education, and Kun Shantavaran, with your brave agenda, that you keep your job for long enough to make a difference. And I can't say how much I enjoyed, or I can say how much I enjoyed just talking to both of you. Thank you very much. This was wonderful, and I wish you all well, and thank you for making our launch so much more illuminating and interesting. Thank you very much. Bye-bye. Thank you, Kun Shantavaran. Thank you, Dato' Lu.
Thank you.
Brilliant.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Pleasure.